Welcome to another museum FAQ video. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator of POW, Paul Orselli Workshop, here on Long Island. And this must be a super interesting topic because we don't have just one guest today. We have two guests today. So that's always a special museum FAQ, and even more so I'm so delighted to welcome Allegra, Burnette, and Joe Fruchter. How are you both doing?
Very
Good.
well, thank you.
Great.
That's great. So, as I mentioned, I always like to give folks a chance to talk a little bit about their background because people's work trajectory and personal trajectories are always super interesting. So, Jill, do you want to lead us off and then we'll hear about Allegra's background and then on to the main conversation?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. So when I was thinking about this, I took it back to like Paul, where you and I first crossed paths, and that was when I was working with museums, mainly with the Brooklyn Children's Museum, also the Brooklyn Museum then of Art, now the Brooklyn Museum, and the Brooklyn Public Library. What I was helping to do at that time was help these institutions produce educational websites, which this is quite a while ago. Were like sort of some of the first ever, using this World Wide Web to do things. And my interest was to use new technology or this new capability to increase access to their collections. And the audience that we were focused on, because I worked in the education department, was for children, their families, and educators. And the idea was to create these digital experiences that didn't take them away from the physical experience, but that reinforced interest and access to museums as physical spaces. Funny thing, my very first job was at a nonprofit art gallery, and I actually left running because I found it too insular and rarefied, and I just, and so this sort of work was about the opposite, like really democratizing, and taking down the walls and any sort of intimidation. So that's sort of how we met, and sort of what leads into the rest of my journey is that, so while I was creating these websites for educators, teachers, no one was talking about bringing the teachers in, to at any point. And I just thought, and I didn't have any lots of language or words behind me yet, but I was like, well, shouldn't we bring them into our design thinking and our process, and not ask them what to do, but just really bring them along and kind of check in and be inspired, by their real experiences, and be inspired by their constraints, like whatever those are in the classroom. Or so, and it just seems so basic to me. And what I now know is the work that I was doing then, that I've now made a career of, I suppose, is usability, user experience design, design thinking, like all of that. But I didn't know that's what I was doing. I was like, shouldn't we do that? So then after a while doing that, I really got, you know, uh, into that bug. And I really started focusing on building out my practice and my expertise as, I guess, an easy way to put it is like a design researcher or a UX researcher. And at the time, I was focused on digital experiences. So for a while, I worked at the New York Times for many years. Then I worked in-house at Etsy to get more hands on with both qualitative and quantitative, because I saw that happening. And I saw, which I think we're going to talk about, this sort of, too strong a word, distrust, or of qualitative research, which is what I was doing mostly at the time, but like a sort of like, well, isn't, and I just threw myself into Etsy because they were sort of the rock stars of all of it. And I also loved Etsy. I tend to work for companies I love and respect. And so I wanted to go in-house after being an outside consultant. And so I went in-house at Etsy to get more hands-on with like how qual and quant methods and data sets play with each other, analytics, things like that. So now I'm at Blue Apron, the meal kit company. I lead research and insights there, and I'm able to work on how digital and physical experiences intertwine. And so it kind of brought it back together for me, which was a desire and a goal. And my work now is, I'd say, equally quantitative and qualitative, and at the end of the day, it's just about embedding a data-driven, customer-first perspective into everything we do.
Well,
Or trying to.
hold that thought. We want to
Yeah.
definitely talk about that, but I'll just insert my editorial comment and say your trajectory couldn't possibly be more Brooklyn if you tried. I mean, you have Brooklyn Museum, Brooklyn Children's Museum, Etsy, and Blue Apron. I'm like, wow.
I guess I'm a locavore. I just,
that's all right.
I work where I eat. I don't know. But so, and just the last thing, I was thinking about, because maybe that all makes sense, but at the time, it doesn't, only in retrospect, it seems to, but the unifying theme of my career is just my obsession with bringing the user's perspective, user, customer, visitor, scientist, teacher, whatever, into the design process. So, the core questions are the same questions. What's the problem we're solving? For whom? Do we deeply understand who they are, what they need, what their context of use is? How do we understand any one moment that we're designing for as part of a broader moment? And thinking not only in terms of those, an individual transaction, because there was e-commerce, or an interaction, but in terms of really building relationships and meaning. That's where growth and opportunity lie, is understanding what room you have to play in versus just a more narrow perspective on measuring and quantifying and diagnosing problems and then fixing problems, things like that.
All right. I can tell. No, I can tell you. I can tell you and Allegra are going to share some good stuff with us. But before we get to the main part of the conversation, we want to hear about Allegra's background. So Allegra, take it away.
Well, and I'm just sitting here nodding to everything Bill said. I'm like, yep. So I'm not sure if this is going to be a big debate of a conversation, but it'll be a reinforcement conversation. So, I'm a little bit, my skew is more to the museum side, with the research and data kind of coming along in support of that. So I have a museum exhibit planning and design graduate degree, and spent many years working for a museum exhibit planning and design firm. So go figure how sometimes that works out. And so, I started doing content coordination, then did graphic design, then started their media department. And, I think there was a lot that this is a while ago. And I think that part of the frustration that I had in that experience is we designed these beautiful, in many cases, new permanent installations, and then take the pretty pictures without the people in them and then go on to the next project. And so there wasn't, in my mind, that kind of learning that you get from like living with the thing that you've built. And so after I had been at Ralph Applebaum Associates for 10 years, with all these different jobs, I then moved over to MoMA, and I led digital media at MoMA for over a decade. And that, you kind of had to sleep in the bed that you made, right? So every decision that you make has an impact. It's either I'm going to keep this thing growing, I'm going to have it up for a short period of time, but you have to really think about all of those pieces within this broader whole. So you do care a lot more about analytics and research and impact and all that sort of thing. And you also try and do a lot more, I think, to understand that before you get into the project and figure out where you're putting your resources. And so, but often you're doing this in sort of low cost, low bandwidth, low, quick and easy kinds of ways. But I think and we can talk about a couple of particular examples later, but I think working with other departments like education and visitor services and things, we were able to kind of get a lot of really important insights about key projects, either before, during, or after we did them. And those had big impacts on the kinds of projects that we did and how we did them. So, after I'd done all of this work within and for museums, I'd had this idea of how I thought things worked in museums or how things should be in processes and design and all that stuff. But I'd never tested it in kind of any outside venue. And so when I was trying to figure out what's next after MoMA, I went to Forrester Research, and I was a principal analyst in customer experience. And so working as a researcher and analyst focused, there were a couple of museum clients, but most of it was not museums. It was retail, banks, healthcare, all kinds of industries. And what it meant is that I got to sort of go and talk to all these people about best practices and what they did and all of that, and kind of then distill that into findings and white papers and advisory consulting types of things. I also one of my colleagues there was Leah Buley, who was the writer of
she's amazing.
The UX.
We're gonna
the UX team of one. So I basically had if you could go to school and study UX, that was basically, I got paid to do that in this job, in part because of Leah and some other colleagues. So, that to me was a really great experience. And the other thing that I learned there was about journey mapping. And journey mapping, again, is exactly what Joe was talking about, where, you're, instead of taking individual interactions or episodes, you're thinking about how those connect both in digital and outside of digital, and how those ladder up to a relationship and a sort of an emotional response and, all of that to a company. And when I first started doing journey mapping as a kind of workshop or exercise, I was like, oh my goodness, this is something museums need desperately, right? Because we were so used to having these conversations across the table, like, I'll do this, and then you'll do this, and then we'll put this together over here. And, this is my part, that's your part. And it was not. And so what journey mapping allowed us to do was kind of change that whole conversation. So it's, let's together figure out what this journey is and who it's for and what the goal is and how they're trying to get there. And then we'll figure out, okay, you do this piece and I'll do this piece and all that, and then bring it together. Yeah. And so, one of the things I was able to do when I was at Forrester is bring some of that, the journey mapping experience and workshopping into some of the museum conferences. So I did a lot of, workshop demos and things at museums in the web and museum and MCN and things like that. So that, because a lot of museums didn't have the resources to become a Forrester client. So this was my way of kind of staying in touch with the community, but also kind of bringing something that I thought was a really valuable tool back to the field. And so, I was at Forrester for about 3.5 years, and then I left and went independent. And I spent the first year of that really working almost as an in-house researcher and analyst for a company called Work & Co., which is a design development agency. And they were always trying to kind of describe, or understand best practice. And I was like, well, the more I looked at it, the more they were doing best practice. And so it was also, again, a really good get deeply immersed in how people who are at the top of their field do this work and do design iteration quickly, and how they bring in data and resource and information as they're making decisions in a very quick but intense and design process for big companies and big kinds of products. And then I had an opportunity, I'm getting to the end of the story.
That's all right.
I had an opportunity to, I was approached by Qatar Museums in Doha to do some work with them. And so that was kind of the impetus I needed to say, okay, I'm starting my LLC, I'm going off on my own, I'm making this official, and also have been working with some other smaller museum, like Newark Museum of Art and the American Museum, the Museum of the American Revolution, and helping them sort of take the data, not doing as much new research, but sort of distilling the research that they have and trying to figure out, okay, what are the insights that we can glean from what you already have, and what are the questions that maybe you still need to answer as you go through additional things. So, it's been a really interesting mix of kind of these big projects and then these opportunities to help, work with and collaborate with some of the smaller organizations. And that brings us to basically today.
Awesome. No, that's perfect. And I'll just mention, since we are in YouTube land, we can include links to references and resources about both of you and your work, but also you just called out some things that you both were like, yeah, what about that? So we want to make sure we include things like that. But I certainly, as evidenced by both of your biographies, I couldn't have two better guests who have worked both inside and outside of museums. So as I mentioned during the warm-up conversation before we started recording, I'm really interested in your approaches towards, I'm just going to use the word authentically, using data and research to provide excellent experiences for end users, whether those are customers, museum visitors, what have you. I mean, if you were speaking to someone, or if you're thinking about the clients you're working with, like where do you even start? I mean, data and research are massive, to me at least. There are lots of potential places to start, but what would you say to someone who, sincerely is interested in using data and research to create an excellent experience for people?
Can I start, Allegra?
Sure.
I'd say you probably already have so much to look into. So Allegra, when you were just saying that when you went in-house to MoMA and you mentioned visitor services, you mentioned education, there's already so many channels to listen to. And in whatever form factor they already have to be getting feedback or sharing information back with you. So
security guards is key. Is
security guards. Yeah, just who's in your house, or whatever it is, and do a listening tour. I do listening tours, and then what you want to do is figure out, maybe you have to figure out what's your goal. What are you trying? This is all pretty abstract, but I guess the main point I want to make just at this level is to do authentic research, find authentic sources of learning and listening. And I think if you look around outside of your area, it's who has contact with that customer, that consumer, that user. That person knows things. And they don't have to know it the way you need to just talk to them and get it and hear from them. They don't know everything, but they know a part, of the puzzle. So I always start with what we have and just being very investigative. I think that part of it is the skill of a journalist or an investigator, just sort of uncovering and looking around. And so I always say start there. I think some people think research is always a very pricey or, unknown in terms of effort, time, expertise. And yes, those things are very important as two experts here, but there's so much that's in your backyard to start with.
Well, that's reassuring. Maybe Allegra, give me some more reassurance.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, to piggyback on that too, and what comes out of that, the narratives from those people who have that direct access are stories, are narratives, and sometimes you take those back to senior staff or leadership or whatever, and have them as quotes, and they kind of go, yeah. Another thing that's actually really good to sort of get that data more sort of to visualize that or make that real to them is things like having senior staff take a pass down at the information desk in the museum, or selling tickets for a day, or and we did that at MoMA ourselves, and then I think senior staff do that occasionally, and it's certainly with the pandemic, I think they've been doing that more as things open up and wanting to kind of support and also be there to see what the situation is. But I think having that front row seat to what's going on is very important.
Eye-opening.
Eye-opening, and great stories come out of it, and they end up remembering those stories. Those are the ones that stick to them with them personally, and they end up kind of telling those again as well. But going back to that kind of lightweight thing, Like, for example, there was, when I was at MoMA, we had the old audio wands, the ones that you push the button, and we were transitioning to using phone, iPhones or smartphones. And we thought this was many years ago at this point, but we thought, well, everybody's coming in with their own device. Do we actually need to hand out phones anymore? And the whole contract about distributing those devices was coming up for renewal. And we're like, do we really need to spend this money and do this? Can't we just sort of give them an app or a website and have them use their own device? And then it was like, well, we think so. Everybody's coming in with these devices, but let's do some research. And there was a research fellow in the education department who, did a fantastic job of just going down and just talking to people, watching people, who were waiting in line to pick up the current devices, asking them questions about, would they, if it was available on their own phone, would they still want to pick up a device? And, part of what we learned is that because MoMA, it may have shifted at this point, certainly more local now probably, but it was about 60% international. And so people were coming in and they were on holiday and they didn't want to use the battery of their phone, or they were worried about roaming charges and all this stuff. So actually, in many cases, they wanted to pick up their own device. And so there were a lot of things, and then we also did similar, that's the royal we, through the education department did a lot of research around the content as well, the kinds of content that people wanted to access on these devices. And then we also looked at how people were using their own phones, in the museum. And so we kind of brought all that together into what the actual, program on the device was, and then we continued to give out devices because of that research. So again, I think she did it, it was not a long, it was a matter of a couple of weeks. It was one person with some help from other people on the team. But just really, very quickly, we're kind of like, oh, that's not the way to go with this.
Well, and that's, that's time super well spent, because if you hadn't done that, if they hadn't done that, and then you had done this implementation that, oops, all of a sudden we've alienated the vast majority of these international users. So
yeah.
And I think what's so important about this is that the decision to do it, so you allocated a moment of, discovery, for lack of a better, like, yes, it was research, but it was like a moment of like, we have some hypotheses, or we have some information gaps. We know we have questions, we have known unknowns. Let's have a moment and ask that. But what I see sometimes is that there's this rush to execution, and it's like, we'll fix it, we'll fix it. And
we don't have time to do that. But
we don't have time.
We also don't have time to fix it after we didn't
exactly,
research
or we don't have the money to do that. But then the amount of money you will spend downstream, and the amount of time you spend downstream of doing, little planning, fast execution versus deliberate planning, fast execution. It's often zero sum or worse. So it's just about having that trust and confidence and best practice to be like, okay, hold on, let's take this moment. Let's not go crazy. Let's not, because the other part of it is that you lead with the intent of iterating, but you have to start with some
and follow through on the iterating, not just get to the first iteration.
Right. But at least start with a first iteration that is based on some learning, not just whoever's at the table and their opinion, or what you can do, not what you should do.
So this all resonates with me as an exhibits person who likes to stress the importance of prototyping and trying things out and iterating. But I want to, here comes a curveball to both of you. I love what you just said. And I think, as both of you indicated, it's also sort of a mindset thing. Like, we're gonna make up our institutional minds, our organizational minds to do this. We see the value of this, the importance of it. But what if you are a museum worker? What if you are part of an organization and you see the value of it, but maybe you are in an organization that doesn't completely see the value of it? How can you help change hearts and minds in that regard? How can you get the wherewithal, the ability to get that intern, that fellow, that coworker to get out there and talk with visitors or contact end users and that. I mean, I love what you just said, but not every situation is conducive to that mindset. So how can you be a bit of a game changer? So there's your curveball for you.
Well, I think it sort of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, like that notion of having the senior staff, kind of be at the information desk. I think it's about making it more real, and making it less onerous and laborious, right? And so, and the prototyping thing you were just talking about, like in that project, once we started to develop the actual application, we would take down paper prototypes or, things on screen and just bring them down into the lobby of the museum and spend, half an hour saying, hey, would you take a look at this? And so that's not
lo-fi prototyping.
You don't have to get a lot of approval necessarily, or permissions and time to do that. You just kind of do it, and then I think what you can do, or you can start to formalize it a little bit more by capturing what that response is, and then coming back to the people who need to be convinced and say, we took this down. This is the feedback we got. This is what we're going to do as a result. And I think you have to tell the stories. You can't just put the data out there. You have to tell the stories around that data. And I think that's kind of one of the challenges I often see is that, people are so focused on like getting this massive pool of data, but haven't actually really thought about what they're actually going to do with it, what questions are, what they're trying to learn from it.
How to interpret
it.
So
how do we interpret it? Who's interpreting it? And so you end up with this pool of data and not doing anything with it. So it's better to have a lot less data and do something with it, and make sure that it's actually good data that you're responding to and you understand what it's telling you, than to have, this huge pool of data that's essentially useless.
I love that statement because that anticipated my next question. It's like, okay, I've got this data, I've collected, I've been diligent, I've talked with people. Now what? Like, how do I make sense of this? I might have 100 different stories from people, but now how do I come up with an institutional, an organizational, whether that's for-profit, nonprofit, museum, not museum? What do I do with that? What do I do with those stories?
So then I think it's also sort of going into the research, knowing what the output will be, and with the goal of being able to communicate not the learnings, but for example, what you're saying, what if you have 100 stories? Like, I can't tell senior VP 100 stories, like they have no time, so that's where like these frameworks, whether it's a journey map or there's an empathy map or there's something, so you distill the stories into something more consumable and more shareable. So you have like raw data, but then that you're going to have to communicate it in a way that it is digestible by someone who wasn't in there. Paul, if I could backtrack, I also felt I heard in your question, like, oh, okay, if we're going to deputize amateur researchers or something like that, or people who aren't as comfortable with research, how do you do that? Like that sounds like a lot to put on someone, because as researchers, it's a craft, and it's, not anyone can design an exhibit, right?
But nevertheless, that is often the case in museums where
Right.
you are working with students or volunteers or interns or people who haven't trained for 20 years or 30 years or whatever.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that it's not that they don't do it. You just sort of have maybe formalize or just you have a little bit of a structure that anyone who's doing it, so it's repeatable and it's consistent, right? So maybe it's like we're observing for this. I think there should be some sort of person who's bringing it all together. Here are the questions. If it's an interview, it's like, it's the same questions. You have a guide of some kind, not a script, but a guide. So there's a bit of scaffolding or structuring that can be done to, set yourself up for success, and not just a lot of noisy data.
Yeah, and I would sort of chime in on that too and say, thinking about different ways to get information, right? Because I think one of the things I really found firsthand is that, what people say or tell you and what people will do are two very different things. So you can't just do a survey and say, well, they told us this, because, they'll...
Everybody clicked on 5. They were extremely satisfied with every part of the interaction.
Well, and I think I sort of felt like we, I guess suffered is maybe not the right word, but almost suffered from this thing of everybody was trying to be helpful and give us, response.
Well, that's called social confirmation bias, right?
Yeah. And so basically, I remember we did some surveying around, kind of features that members might like on a members only portal, right? And so we got the information. We're like, these are the top 3 things that we heard people would like. And so you build those things, and granted, I think there was not enough marketing or communication around what was available, but it didn't really get the response that we were expecting based on that survey results.
The energy,
kind of
engagement,
So what they then did, I think didn't kind of live up to sort of what they had said that they would do. And so I think that's the other thing too, is just don't put all of your research and learning eggs in one basket, because or if you do a survey, figure out a way to kind of follow up and reinforce it in some other way, because one methodology doesn't give you all the information. And I'm not saying that to kind of scare people off, but just to sort of say, go beyond a survey.
And I found sorry, Paul, do you want to?
No, go. I was just going to say quickly that's also strikes me as part of this iteration piece too. You've built this thing, and now how is it getting used? And okay, maybe we need to tweak and change this slightly. So
it's amazing to me. So even people think research, so you do surveys. Yeah. And I'm like, and I'm a full stack researcher. I do mixed methods, and where it's just like, well, what's the question, what's the best way to answer that question, so it's just, but I think that people they have a mental model, not that there's anything wrong with them, but I think the job of the researcher also is just to expose there's all these different ways we'll get information that's valuable. Sometimes a survey is perfect, because at that point you are quantifying and you need a measurable representative result of something. So, but if you're in a more generative space, meaning you're still creating the ideal, you're still shaping it, you're still figuring out, what are we doing? What are we building? Who is this for? Then you need different types of research that are more maybe observational or conversational, and you don't even, that you don't know what you're going to hear, and you want that, so what I talk about is that research, to use that word, is like, you're still learning, you're divergent, but survey stuff, or that's convergent. That's when you're narrowing or just evaluating or diagnosing.
I was going to say too, kind of picking up on something that you asked about earlier, in terms of the synthesis of it, because there's a prioritization question that comes out of this too, right? Where 5 different people may say 5 different things and give you 5 different ideas about what to do. And so how do you, who do you listen to and all of that? So I think there's are there overlaps in responses? Are people telling us similar things? Can we see patterns out of what they're telling us? And then, you don't want to kind of chase after every shiny bubble, that comes up. And so I think then it's a question of, okay, well, how is this serving what we're trying to do? How does this serve the audience need that we're trying to meet?
Right.
As well as perhaps some organizational goal or need that we're trying to include in that.
You need storytelling and editing.
Yeah.
Well,
and,
for the purpose of being strategic, because at the end of the day, whether it's a business business or an org, it needs to work for both. So, it's that Henry Ford attribution quote, which is if you ask people, what they want, they'll say faster horses. But what Henry Ford wanted was like, what is the next thing to innovate? So maybe that's a little tangential, but I think it's about knowing at the get-go, it's not just 100 stories, it's that those will distill into themes, and then you do some sort of alignment exercise, whether it's with
or ideation about going, okay, that's the base and we're going to go way over here,
right. Or with priorities. Okay,
Yeah.
But we said that our 2021 priorities are really to bring in more new museum visitors. Oh, okay, well, if we're talking about new museum visitors, then this problem becomes 80, not 50. And then this problem over here, that's for like the repeat visitor. That's what strategy is, right? Is knowing what you're not doing. Being able to say no, right? So,
using data to help you make the argument about why you're prioritizing certain things too. Like that's also where it comes into play too, to be able to say, so and so on the senior leadership team asked for this thing, but in fact, everybody that we interviewed is actually asking for this other thing. So, your thing's going on the back burner because of that, like you can start to have a conversation that's not just like, we think your idea is not so great,
Right.
That it can be a little bit more framed around what those audience needs are.
Yeah, that usually never goes over that well. Your ideas just wasn't that great.
But not even that it's not that great, but they're kind of higher priorities, right? Because the bubble machine of ideas will never stop in a museum, and you just have to figure out which of those to poke first.
Well, I'm going to say our bubble machine is going to have to stop for now, but I always know when I've had a good conversation, because I feel like my synapses are still firing in my brain. So there's a lot of good stuff that we've touched on here, and I'm sure the people watching will agree. As I mentioned earlier, we can include links and references to your own work, but to things that you think might be useful to people that we touched on in our conversation. And I am so thankful that I had the opportunity to speak with you both today, and you were able to take the time. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for helping my synapses fire. I don't know. I don't always feel like that after a conversation.
Oh, that's great.
No, that's great. Thanks.
Well,
thanks.
And I would just say, don't be afraid of it to people who are listening. Like, don't be afraid to dive in. And once you get in and start to get some findings, you realize, that it's not a large barrier of entry, but also how valuable it is to the work that you do.
Absolutely. Thanks again. Thanks again so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.